-40 degrees, not cold, not freezing, -0.40. The kind of cold that turns exposed skin white in under 4 minutes. The kind of cold that has quietly killed strong. Experienced, well-equipped men in the Alaskan wilderness every single winter for over 100 years. And right in the middle of it, a 69-year-old engineer was sitting inside a corrugated steel arch bolted to a flatbed trailer. Warm, comfortable, eating a hot meal, completely unbothered, while every cabin around him was hemorrhaging heat through its walls, through its corners, through every seam in its roof. He wasn't fighting the cold, he had solved it. What he built, with his own 2 hands at 69 years old, proved to be 65 degrees. Warmer inside than the traditional Alaskan cabins right beside it. Not 5 degrees warmer. Not 10. 65. This is the full story of how a retired engineer looked at one of the most hostile environments on Earth, threw out every assumption about how a shelter should be built, and engineered something so effective, so precise, and so brutally logical that it made every other cabin in the Alaskan wilderness look like a cold tent. Stay with me, because by the end of this, you're never going to look at a building the same way again. Let's start with a question nobody ever asks. Why do we build boxes? Think about it seriously for a moment. Every house you've ever lived in, every cabin you've slept in, every structure human beings have built for the last 3,000 years, almost all of them are rectangles. 4 flat walls, 4 90-degree corners, a flat or peaked roof overhead. We have done this so many times for so long that we've completely stopped asking whether it actually works. It doesn't. Not in Alaska. Not at -40. And this engineer, 4 decades of structural design behind him, a lifetime of watching buildings fail in extreme cold, knew exactly why. Here's the physics. When you build a rectangular structure in brutal cold, cold air hammers against your flat walls from every direction. It finds the path of least resistance. And in a box, those paths are everywhere. At every 90-degree corner, 2 cold exterior surfaces meet. The north-facing wall, the west-facing wall. They don't just add together at that corner. They compound each other. The temperature at a rectangular corner is dramatically worse than anywhere along a flat wall. Engineers call it thermal bridging. Homeowners call it drafty room. In Alaska at -40, it's the difference between surviving the night and not. And then there's the ceiling problem. Warm air rises. Everybody knows this. In a rectangular room, that warm air floats up, hits a flat ceiling, and sits there 6, 7, 8 feet above where any human being actually exists. Meanwhile, your feet are freezing. Your stove is burning through fuel at an obscene rate, and the heat you're generating is doing almost nothing for the person who needs it. This engineer had spent his career watching flat walls bleed heat and rectangular corners destroy thermal efficiency. He had calculated it. He had measured it. He had documented it across structure after structure in environments where the cold had no mercy and the margin for error was 0. So when he decided to build his own off-grid shelter in the Alaskan wilderness at 69 years old, he made a decision that most people would have laughed at. He wasn't going to build a box. The Quonset hut was invented in 1941 by the United States Navy. Developed at Quonset Point, Rhode Island, it was designed for one specific purpose: to be shipped anywhere on Earth, assembled by one man with basic tools in a matter of hours, and protect whoever was inside it from whatever the planet could throw at them. It was used on every front of World War II: Pacific Islands, European winters, North African deserts. Over 160,000 of them were built. They served as hospitals, barracks, command centers, and weapon storage across every climate on the planet. And after the war, tens of thousands of them found a second life across the coldest states in America, because farmers and homesteaders in Minnesota, Montana, and Alaska had quietly figured out what the military already knew. This shape holds heat like nothing else on Earth. The semicircular arch has no 90-degree corners. 0. Cold air finds nothing to exploit, nothing to attack. The force simply redirects along the curve and dissipates. Snow that accumulates on a flat roof sits there, compresses, and forces cold air through every seam it can find. On an arched roof, snow slides off under its own weight before it can build up. And inside, the curved ceiling creates what fluid dynamics engineers call a laminar convective loop. Warm air rises, yes, but instead of pooling uselessly against a flat ceiling, it follows a curve, rolls gently back down the sides, and recirculates continuously through the living space at the exact height where a human body needs it. The arch is not a style choice. It is a thermal engineering solution. And our engineer, 69 years old, for decades of structural experience in his hands, Alaska's most brutal winter at his door, chose it for exactly that reason. But here's where this build gets genuinely remarkable. He didn't just choose the arch. He put on wheels. And then he built the most aggressively insulated mobile shelter most engineers have ever examined. The foundation of the entire structure is a heavy-duty tandem axle trailer, the kind rated for over 14,000 pounds. This is not a recreational trailer. This is serious industrial iron, built to carry the kind of loads that break ordinary equipment. On top of that trailer, he erected a prefabricated corrugated steel arch kit. These kits were originally designed for agricultural storage. They bolt together in sections using high-grade stainless steel hardware. No welding required. No heavy equipment. One man, a set of wrenches, and a methodical understanding of the assembly sequence. The arch went up, and then the real work began. Because here is a problem that most people building with steel never fully solve. Raw corrugated steel is one of the worst insulated materials on the planet. It conducts heat and cold faster than almost any other building material. Touch a steel wall at -40 degrees. Your skin will stick to it. The steel doesn't resist the cold. It invites it in. So he built what engineers call a thermal wall assembly, layer by layer, from the outside in. And every single layer was chosen for a specific, calculated reason. The first thing he applied was a continuous polyethylene thermal break layer between the steel arch and everything that would come after it. This single step, which most DIY builders skip entirely because it feels like an unnecessary expense, is the most critical move in the entire build. The thermal break severs a conductive path between the cold steel shell and the interior of the structure. Without it, the steel acts as a radiator, pulling every degree of warmth you generate and dumping it straight to the wall into the frozen air outside. With it, the steel and the interior become thermally disconnected. The cold stays outside. The warmth stays in. Then came the closed-cell spray foam, applied directly against the thermal break layer, sprayed into every curve of the corrugated steel. Closed-cell foam does two things simultaneously that no other insulation material can match. It expands to fill every gap, every crevice, every seam, every microscopic space where air could move, and it cures into a rigid, waterproof vapor barrier. In Alaska, moisture-driven heat loss is a silent killer of cabin warmth. When warm interior air meets a cold wall surface, moisture condenses, soaks into insulation, and destroys its thermal performance. Ice forms inside your walls and turns your insulation into a cold sponge. The spray foam stops that process at the source by preventing moisture from ever entering the wall assembly in the first place. Over the spray foam came the rigid foam board, 4 to 6 inches of it, stacked in layers. Every inch of quality rigid foam board delivers approximately R6 of thermal resistance. 6 inches of rigid board alone achieves R36. To put that in context, the standard residential building code in most cold climate states requires R20 in exterior walls. He built at nearly double that value in a mobile structure on a trailer. And then, over the rigid foam, he installed tongue-in-groove solidwood panels as the interior finish surface. Most people assume this is a purely aesthetic choice. It is not. Solidwood absorbs and releases moisture, slowly, naturally, without condensation. In a closed space heated by combustion appliances in a dry, frozen environment, that natural humidity regulation is critically important. It keeps the air breathable. It prevents the cracking and static electricity that plagues drier interiors in deep winter. And it adds one more thin but real layer of thermal mass to a wall assembly that is already performing far beyond anything a traditional cabin achieves. This is the wall. Steel shell, thermal break, spray foam vapor barrier, 6 inches of rigid foam board, tongue-in-groove wood interior. That assembly, combined with the arch geometry that eliminates corner heat loss entirely, produced thermal performance that left every conventional cabin in comparison standing cold and embarrassed. Now here's the moment this build goes from impressive to extraordinary. The thermometer test. He set it up with scientific rigor. 3 calibrated thermometers, 1 outside in the ambient air, 1 inside a comparable traditional Alaskan cabin with a standard with stove running at normal operating capacity, and 1 inside the Quonset with nothing. No supplemental heat, no stove, no propane. Just the structure itself holding whatever warmth it could. The ambient temperature outside dropped to negative 40 degrees Fahrenheit overnight. This is not an unusual night in the Alaskan interior. This is Tuesday in January. The traditional cabin, with its stove running, registered negative 5 degrees Fahrenheit inside its walls. -5, with a stove burning. A man inside that cabin is still in danger. He is wearing every layer he owns. His water is freezing. His hands shake when he reaches for the fuel to keep the stove going. His body is working constantly just to stay warm, burning calories and energy he cannot afford to lose. The Quonset, with 0 supplemental heat, registered positive 25 degrees Fahrenheit inside, 25 above 0, versus 5 below 0, with no heat source at all inside the Quonset, and a full stove running in the traditional cabin. The difference, 65 degrees, was not a rounding error. It was not favorable weather conditions. It was not luck. It was engineering. Then he turned on the small propane heater inside the Quonset, and the interior climbed to 55, then 60 degrees Fahrenheit, on the coldest recorded night of the test. A man inside that structure was comfortable enough to remove his jacket, comfortable enough to sit at a table and write, comfortable enough to sleep through the night without waking up to feed a fire. The traditional cabin never got above 10 degrees inside with its stove running full blast. This is what happens when you stop fighting physics and start using it. But a warm shell is not a livable shelter. A shelter needs water. It needs power. It needs heat you can control in systems that will not fail you at 3 in the morning when the temperature drops and the wilderness outside does not care whether you live or die. He understood this. He had spent 40 years designing systems that could not fail, and he brought that same engineering discipline to every mechanical system inside the Quonset. Heating is the first and most critical. He installed a vented propane heater as the primary system. Propane burns cleanly, produces controllable heat, and, critically in this environment, does not require electricity to operate at its most basic function. The heater vents through an engineered roof penetration, sealed with expanding foam collars. No heat escapes around the vent pipe. No cold air infiltrates through it. The penetration is thermally perfect. The backup is a compact wood-burning stove. And this is not just a redundancy measure on paper. In a survival environment, visible fire has a psychological value that cannot be overstated. Watching flames means knowing with absolute certainty that heat is being generated. It means having a heat source that requires no fuel line, no regulator, no igniter, just wood, of which Alaska has an infinite supply and a match. When everything else fails, and in the wilderness, everything eventually does, the wood stove keeps a man alive. Power comes from a rooftop solar array, feeding a 200 amp-hour lithium iron phosphate battery bank. LiFePO4 chemistry was the right choice here for a specific reason. Unlike standard lithium-ion batteries, lithium iron phosphate cells maintain usable capacity at low temperatures and do not carry the thermal runaway risk that makes other lithium chemistries dangerous in enclosed spaces. The battery bank powers the LED lighting, the 12-volt water pump, the phone and radio charging station, and a controller for the diesel heater backup circuit. In Alaska's brutal winter, solar days are short, sometimes brutally short, so the build includes a small propane generator for battery top-up when the panels cannot keep pace. 2 fuel sources feeding 1 battery bank. The system has no single point of failure. Water is where most off-grid builds collapse completely. Because water management in an environment where the ambient temperature is -40 is not an engineering challenge. It is an engineering emergency waiting to happen. A pipe freeze at -40 does not just inconvenience you. It ruptures, it floods, it destroys. The solution was elegant in its simplicity. The 50-gallon potable water tank lives entirely inside the insulated shell. It never touches the outside air. It never approaches freezing temperature. The 12-volt inline pump delivers pressurized flow to a compact stainless sink. The drain runs through a self-heated hose, a resistance wire wrapped around the drain line that prevents freeze-up at the only point where the water system exits the warm interior and enters the cold underside of the trailer. The entire system runs on 12-volt power from the battery bank. No grid connection. No pressure pump that requires 120 volts. No vulnerability to a power outage at the worst possible moment. The kitchen is where the build reveals something most people would never have guessed. A full-size refrigerator, a 2-burner propane cooktop, wall-mounted cabinetry stocked with provisions. And here's the detail that only an engineer would think to mention. At ambient temperatures of negative 40 degrees, a refrigerator does not have to work hard. The cold ambient air does most of the work for the compressor. The fridge runs more efficiently in an Alaskan winter than it ever would in a heated suburban kitchen. The engineer designed for real conditions, not average conditions, and in doing so found an unexpected advantage hiding inside a constraint that would have defeated a less disciplined thinker. Every meal cooked on that propane stove generates BTUs. Every BTU from cooking is a BTU the heater does not have to produce. In a structure that's well insulated, the thermal gain from cooking a single hot meal is measurable on the interior thermometer. Food is fuel in more ways than one. And here is where this build transcends the specific and becomes universal. This is not just a story about one man and one structure in one frozen corner of the planet. This is a story about what happens when a person with real knowledge, real experience, and the willingness to question every assumption actually sits down and solves a problem from the ground up. For lessons are buried inside this build, and they apply far beyond Alaska. They apply to every shelter, every off-grid system, every structure you'll ever think about building or living in. The first lesson, geometry, is insulation. Before you spend a single dollar on insulation materials, ask yourself what shape your structure is. The arch outperforms a rectangle not because of what you put inside its walls, but because of the physics of its form. Shape is thermal performance. If you build a box, you are accepting a thermal penalty at every corner before your insulation does a single thing. The engineer understood this at the design stage, before a single bolt was turned, and everything that followed was building on a foundation of correct geometry. The second lesson, air sealing is more important than R value. A wall with an R value of 40, poorly sealed, performs worse in real-world conditions than a wall with an R value of 20 that has been made perfectly airtight. Air infiltration bypasses insulation entirely. Cold air moving through a gap in your wall assembly does not care how much foam board you have installed. It goes straight through the gap around the insulation and into your living space. The spray foam in this build was not chosen because it has the highest R value per inch. It was chosen because it seals, because it fills every gap, every seam, every microscopic void where air could move. Airtight first, then R value. In that order. Always. The third lesson, mobility is a strategic advantage, not a compromise. Most people, when they think about building in a remote location, think about permanence. They think about foundations, about structures that will stand for decades, about putting down roots. This engineer thought differently. By building on a trailer, he created a shelter that can be moved when the location becomes inaccessible, that can be repositioned when the terrain changes, that can be pulled out of flood zone, relocated to a better site, or simply driven to wherever the season demands. The structure is not tied to the land. It serves the man who built it, not the other way around. The fourth lesson is the one that separates the people who survive from the people who don't. Every critical system needs a backup. Heat, propane primary with stove backup. Power, solar primary, generator backup. Water, pressurized pump primary, gravity-fed manual backup. In a city, a single point of failure is an inconvenience. You call someone, you go somewhere else. In the Alaskan wilderness at negative 40 degrees, a single point of failure is a clock. It starts counting the moment the system goes down, and it counts toward an outcome that cannot be undone. This engineer did not build backups because he expected things to fail. He built backups because 40 years of engineering had taught him one immovable truth. Everything eventually does. There's something else about this build that doesn't show up in the temperature numbers or the insulation specifications. Something that lives in the image of a 69-year-old man standing in front of a corrugated steel arch on a flatbed trailer, in the middle of an Alaskan winter, knowing exactly what is built and exactly why it works. Most people at 69 do not attempt this. Most people at 69 have stopped asking whether things could be done differently. They have accepted the conventional answers, the rectangular houses, the standard insulation values, the grid-connected utilities, the permanent foundations. This man spent his entire career learning how structures fail, learning where heat goes when it disappears, learning what cold does to materials, to joints, to systems designed for average conditions by people who never planned for the worst. And then he retired. And instead of walking away from all of that knowledge, he used it. He used every lesson, every failure he had ever calculated, every thermal bridge he had ever documented, every system he had ever watched collapse under conditions that exceeded its design parameters. He took all of it and he built something that worked. 65 degrees warmer inside, in the deepest, most brutal stretch of an Alaskan winter, in a structure that hitches to a truck and drives away when you're done with it. That is not luck. That is not a trick. That is not the kind of thing you stumble into with a prefabricated kit and a good attitude. That is engineering, real engineering, the kind that comes from decades of disciplined attention to physics, to failure, to the relentless, unforgiving feedback of the real world. And it was done, is being done, by a man 69 years old, in Alaska in winter, alone. The next time you look at a building, any building, ask yourself what shape it is. Ask yourself whether cold is winning inside its walls. Ask yourself whether the person who designed it was fighting the physics or using them. Because after watching what this engineer built, one truth is impossible to escape. The box was never the answer. It just took 69 years of experience, one corrugated steel arch, and the coldest winter in the Alaskan interior to prove it.